It's now my great pleasure and honor to introduce Leslie Bowe. Leslie Bowe is Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of English and Asian American Studies and Dorothy Draheim Professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is the author and editor of numerous books and articles that have become touchstones in Asian American feminisms and Asian American literary and cultural studies, among them the books Betrayal and Other Acts of Subversion, Feminism, Sexual Politics, Asian American Women's Literature, Partly Colored, Asian Americans and Racial Anomaly in the Segregated South, and the focus of today's talk, Racist Love, Asian Abstraction, and the Pleasures of Fantasy. In work that opens up the intricate mechanisms of power and desire, Leslie's scholarship shows how race and gender are negotiated through sexuality, aesthetics, fantasy, pleasure, and violence. Across her work, there can be found a stunningly precise attention to how intimate affairs hold political tensions, distilling national and global relations within the everyday. While there is an unwavering commitment to Asian American women and Asian American feminisms, her work is uncompromising in its hard look at the moments when political identification, agency, and belonging become uneasy, asking us to reckon with ambivalence and contradiction. But importantly, the critical position to which her work invites us is neither lonely nor unpleasurable. Something I love most about Leslie's writing is that alongside its incisiveness and irony, it is quite often playful, funny, and tender. On a more personal note, I've had the pleasure of studying with Leslie as my graduate advisor, and I can say that the qualities found in her scholarship are mirrored in her mentorship and teaching. Her guidance and inspiration challenged me to go farther than I ever dreamed I could go. Moreover, while working as her teaching assistant for a course aligned to this book, I saw how the questions that Racist Love poses invite students to both fall in love with Asian American literature and culture and to understand the complexities of those attachments. To use a word that is sometimes maligned in academic spaces, Racist Love is relevant, giving us a rich theoretical framework for reimagining commonplace concepts from cultural appropriation to yellow fever. Once you've read and absorbed Racist Love, it will be hard not to find it everywhere, not only in our physical and virtual worlds, in objects from cute collectibles to digital avatars, but in our innermost twisted feelings that we might not otherwise dare to name. Now I will turn it over to Leslie to give a talk about the book. After her talk, I'll ask her a few questions, and then we will have an audience Q&A. So thank you, Leslie.
Thank you so much, Erica. I want to thank both Stephanie, who for arranging this talk, and for Erica for devoting, all her attention and time to this. She was definitely at the foreground in the beginning of this project that I'm going to be sharing with you. So first of all, let me say that I'm coming to you from Madison, Wisconsin, not necessarily cyberspace, and that is the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk, originally called Dezhou. So I wanted to begin by talking a little bit about how this book came about that is intimately connected to the course that Erica was there with me teaching. So this book came about through a kind of effective disconnect. So I'm in the field of Asian American studies, and I think the field is incredibly exciting. I love the archive. I love the people that I work with. I'm committed to its social justice outcomes. I love the methods of reading, right, that my field has developed in English. I'm completely fascinated with the field of Asian American studies. And yet, I teach at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is a primarily white institution. And so when I first came here, students really resisted taking their course in ethnic studies, some waiting until the very end of their senior year to do so, like it's a hoop, right, for them to jump through. And so it's not so much resistance as it was reluctance. And yet the students themselves were very much wrapped up in things Asian, right? So fandom of BTS, they were members of the anime club, their partner was Asian, or they just had Chinese for dinner. And I was very puzzled about that kind of affective disconnect. And I thought, oh, I can actually work with that. I can harness that idea of intimacy or desire in the thing and the racialized pleasures of those things to unveil political structure, which is something that Asian American students themselves were more than ready to enter into as well. So yeah, this book is about race fetishism and how Asianness is a conduit of desire within American culture, a phenomena that Bell Hooks has called eating the other. Some of you may be familiar with that very famous essay. This is about exploring the darker side of racial pleasures. And it led me to the ways in which professed attraction serves as a very form of anti-Asian bias. And so for popular audiences, I often say at this point, it's tapping in to that kind of queasy feeling that you might get when somebody compliments and tells you how much they love your culture. So I wanted to begin with a content warning because some of the images that I'm going to be showing tonight are in fact demeaning. And they are the ones that do intrigue me because they operate in a kind of gray area that blurs the notion of racial harm with racial delight. And so let me just go ahead and share my slides with you. So what you should be seeing in front of you is the book cover along with the citation. So if that's not the case, please let me know. So my title, Racist Love, comes from Frank Chin and Jeffrey Paul Chan's 1972 essay called Racist Love, which I see as a foundation in Asian American studies. And I know it's a very controversial essay, primarily for its gender inscription. But when I went back to look at it, and here's the citation that I've included here, I thought, well, it's kind of prescient for the way it talked about the splitness of racial identification. So they say each racial stereotype comes in two models. The unacceptable hostile Black stud has his acceptable counterpart in the form of Stephen Fetchit. For Fu Manchu and the Yellow Peril, there's Charlie Chan and his number one son. There is racist hate and racist love. And so prior to this point, I had always stayed away from stereotype analysis in my courses, even though it's a foundation for race studies in the United States. You know, it seemed almost like a cliche in ethnic studies that your content was going to be limited to talking about good images versus bad images, as if it remained the same as a field since the 1970s. But what I realized here is that Chin and Chan were really recognizing the effective work of the stereotype and the ways that it operates along a continuum of split feeling. And I thought it was really prescient in forecasting the ways that now Asian Americans occupy a very anxious or ambivalent space in the United States, something that we are going to see increasing, I think. And so a key takeaway for me was in researching this book was the way in which the stereotype and fetish encode similar structures of desire. And so the first takeaway, and I really only have four, is that both stereotyping and fetishization depend upon an economical reduction. So the whole of a people or a culture reduced to a single thing, whether it's an object or a trait, or a dish in cuisine, or here, as you see on my cover, hair. So the thing becomes exaggerated and magnified. So it's a kind of paradoxical juxtaposition, the reduction and then magnification of a singularity of an object or a thing. And so stereotype reduction and exaggeration in which the part stands for the whole. And so, you know, to me in researching this book, I was always taken by this strange phrasing that people would use, let's go for Chinese or let's eat Thai. And I thought, you know, that's such a weird phrasing. It's like eat Thai people, you know, because the closeness between Asianness and food are so associated that they need no object to be stated. So I thought that was like, kind of investigating that idea of fetishistic reduction. The second takeaway is the way in which reduction enables a certain kind of pleasurable feeling. And so across the plane of this book, it's not only eroticism, which is the obvious one, but also things like appetite and things like affection and things like humor or even caregiving. And so that kind of affective range is something that I was interested in exploring. Um, when I talk about racist love, I wanted to point to the cover that you're seeing before you, because I do think that that cover is very deliberate on my part. And one way to engage the idea of race fetishism is through storytelling. And so one of the origins of the course is, I had met this white academic man who was telling me how he had met his Chinese wife in China. And so he told me the story about how he went to a concert in which she was playing the violin, but he could only see the back of her head. And he tells me the story that he, in fact, fell in love with the back of her head. Because apparently it was all, China was such a fantasy, in his mind, all he needed was the back of the head to fill in like the rest. And I think he told me that story because he thought it was incurably romantic. And I was like, okay, that's pretty kinky. So on one hand, racist love focuses on the way in which things incite the fantastic or fantasy. And that's definitely one of the foundations. But I do think that there's a complication that is found in every chapter in that engagement. And that's also suggested by the fullness of what is actually the inspiration for the cover, which is Hong Chung Zhang's charcoal on paper triptych, The Three Graces. And so I'm showing you the fullness of that. It's a self-portrait of her and her two sisters as these almost unworldly creatures made entirely of hair. And they are over 8 feet tall. So it's very larger than life. And I also find it startlingly beautiful, but also slightly monstrous. It's shown as through this Smithsonian as part of an exhibit on Asian American portraiture. Kind of radical in denying the face, right, as the fountain of individuality in portraiture. And I really thought it did raise these questions, both on its foundational scale about how substitution enables an abstracted Asianness that is both erotic and aesthetic, but the pleasures also in imagining the self through a faceless collective. And so for me, the complication here, even in the back of the head portrayal, was about, I think this portrait really speaks to the idea of political desire as well, or a kind of power in unity, or a power in anonymity or facelessness as it goes with a group, right? So counter to individuality. And that was kind of the twist that I thought really encapsulated some of the things that I'm talking about in this book in its visual form. So third takeaway, I was really struck by the classic Freudian view of the fetish and its implications for racial feeling as a whole. So in theorizing the fetish, object arousal forestalls a specific kind of anxiety. And I was really struck by the ambivalence underlying that. And as one of my former colleagues in McClintock has recognized, fetishistic desire is both a sign of power and an indication of its instability, because it kind of masks that sense of terror. And you can also see that here in my slide, which is also taken from Homi Bhabha, about the anxiety that underlies the repetition of stereotyping. Like, why do stereotypes keep replicating themselves? Why do we keep needing to restate them in forms? And it's because we know they're not true, right? So that, the anxiety and like, well, I must make that true by repeating it. But so in naming, rather than naming stereotypical content today, I wanted to highlight the ways in which Asian racial difference incites a specific desiring structure characterized by equivocation. So in Racist Love, I see fetishistic attraction to Asianized things as very symptomatic of racial fears. I think that they occlude them. I think they cloud them, so they're unseen. A coping mechanism, racist love, is fundamentally narcissistic. It's about the nation's use or individuals' use of the Asianized thing to mitigate anxiety surrounding Asian difference. And that's an anxiety that, with the notion of China threat, that I do think is going to grow in upcoming years. We also saw that with COVID as well. I think in this book, the non-human is used as a conduit for understanding racial intelligibility. And so each chapter is organized around a specific racial form. And just to say this briefly, like in the first chapter here, as you see, it's about the way in which animals become racialized in educational picture books for the young, how we use species difference in order to talk about racial prejudice for and to children. So that's the first chapter, the idea of animal stand-ins. The second is, and this is what Erica referred to in her introduction as well, the way in which household items like this one, which is just a simple, innocent kitchen timer, can be said to be both offensive and cute. So I'm exploring kawaii as a racial form in chapter 2. In chapter 3, I was looking at AI in the form, as it takes the form of young, attractive Asian women, and how that begins to script our relation to technology, both in fantasy, SF, sci-fi formats, but as well as in actual robots, like the one that you see here, based on actress Gemma Chan. So scripting that relationship as one of both domination and of care. But then the twist and the complication really about how that image is also used to talk about issues of sexual consent. And so today I'm actually going to draw a bit from chapter 4, which is the last chapter, which actually goes in the direction of race fetishism with a twist. And that'll be what I'm talking about today. I chose for this image, this is actually a life-sized realistic fetish doll that artist Laurie Simmons stages for her series, The Love Doll, which is a photographic series. So there's a little bit of a bait and switch that you'll see in this talk today, my brief talk today, because I want to give a lot of time to engagement and questions. So psychoanalyst Robert Stoller surmised that the fetish is, quote, a story masquerading as an object. So a story masquerading as an object. And so I was wondering, what is the story generated by actually disavowing fetishistic love? So I'm most interested in this chapter in what political desires are revealed in resisting that pleasure in Asian racial difference, and how these desires in resistance mimic the ambivalent structure of fetishistic pleasure itself. So a little bit of a shift. To what extent do communally agreed upon rules about racial representation create taboos surrounding racial discourse? And I came to realize that as an academic in Asian American studies and as a teacher, that I was complicit in constructing that taboo. So a little bit of surprise to me. So just to start with the basics, Asian fetishism is a quintessential form of racist love, or as Bell Hooks put it, quote, fucking is the other. And so that in American culture is surprisingly in the open when it comes to Asian Americans. Asian fetish comes with its own Wikipedia page, as well as manuals like this one that I'm sharing with you. And of course, I can tell you how to attract Asian women, not because I am one, but because I read this book. So seen as an affront to individuality, the Asian fetish represents a form of harm that reflects back a presumably degrading fantasy a reduced personhood. So it's an affront, right, to selfhood. So you see that here in Kit Fulbeck's photographic series, Part Asian, 100% Hapa, a woman who says, my last boyfriend told me he liked me because of my race, so I dumped him. And of course, that is the secret to attracting Asian women, is presumably the unironic in this book, treat her like a person, which is to say, hide the fact that your desires are actually racial desires. And I think confronting the fetish also involves, in a very simple sense, some kind of inversion of erotic power dynamics. You also see this in the photographic series that Kit Fulbeck did here, where this man testifies, quote, many of my ex-girlfriends were habitual half Asian daters. These women considered half Asian men exotic, sexy, and just like Keanu Reeves in The Matrix. He says, I consider these stereotypes appropriate because I got laid. And so if yellow fever represents a form of racial management, does it likewise suggest a means of self-affirmation, which is what we get in this image, from this man here? And I think that so many Asian visual artists in film and performance and art have entered into a much more complex territory than either of those that I've highlighted here for you, kind of bookending, like the rejection, absolute rejection, right, of being the object of a fetish or its inversion. And I thought I would share with you one of those examples today, the performance artist Laurel Nakatande, who actually talks about and seems to embrace scopophilia in the form of her series Lucky Tiger. And I'll show you a few of these images here. So this series is basically, she stages herself in different postures following the idea of American pinup posters. But the twist in these 4x6 photographs is that she has taken a picture of herself in addition to soliciting collaboration from anonymous men on Craigslist to come look at the view of the pictures. And the catch is that they had to ink their hands in order to view and handle the photographs. And so every shot that she shows herself of in this, as this pinup, has a little bit of a twist. You have to look at her image through the fingerprints of their hands. And she really stages herself in a manner of self-objectification as a kind of twist on racial sexual voyeurism, in which their subjectivity becomes inextricable from the pleasurable thingness. And that's what she's doing here by staging herself as sexual object. But then our ability to access that as a viewer or to participate in it is always mediated by seeing that someone has come there first and is partly obscuring our vision by their fingerprints, right? And so you see the ways in which an artist like Nakatande is like giving in, right, to this idea of scopophilia or fetishism, but she's also kind of playing with it in a kind of complex way. So I wanted to shift to another complication of racist love, and that's the gray area of political desire rather than erotic desire. And I wanted to suggest that encountering the fetish and denouncing the harm of typing, it actually enables the phantasmatic Asian American subject, right, to emerge. So yet, to what extent is the subject position, Asian American, also a type? So while chasing creative and popular engagements on this topic, I gradually became aware of how my own presumptive charge as an Asian Americanist to repudiate this form of racist love potentially reinforced the taboos that serve to eroticize interracial intimacy. And so my academic practice unwittingly began to mirror the split structure of fetishistic desire as it began to vacillate in my relationship to my own objects of study between both repulsion and attraction. But you can also see in my relationship with the Nakadante, like what is she really doing there? And so I wanted to give two examples of that in the blur between academic pursuit and the notion of being a fetishist myself. And that came apparent to me after I encountered the sculpture that you see here on your screen, which is called Drag McQueen. And it's done by Canadian visual artist Alicia Lim. And what they've done is create wedge boots fashioned from cake. And one was chocolate, the other in vanilla. And this is a chocolate one. And it actually reads, "Shoes, oh my God, these shoes rule. Let's get some, bitch." And it was supposed to be a riff on Liam Kyle Sullivan's video Shoes, which satirize shopping as well as a shoe fetish. And I just really love the way that this piece played with so many forms of object substitution and the process of fulfilling desire through the object themselves. And part of the reading is based on the fact that the word bitch there, the I in it could be read as kind of both E and U. Lim has this book called 100 Butches, which is actually a series of 100 sketches of women that they have crushed on. And so then I also read the shoe in relation to that book. But the processes of fulfilling desire through this shoe cake, it's cake to shoe to woman, from eating to shopping to sex. And I thought that was really intriguing about what the sculpture was actually doing. And I was kind of slightly obsessed with it. So I actually went to chase it down. And so I emailed the artists asking them, for one, what happened to this cake? Where is the cake? And can I get a photograph of the sculpture? And unfortunately, I put my query like this. I have to ask, did you save it or did you throw it out? Better yet, did you eat it? And so Lim's email response to me was telling. They replied, and this is on the slide here, "Are you Asian? I'm wondering if you're coming to a place of being subject to the fetish or of indulging the fetish. I'm sorry if this question seems rude, but I just want to make sure that I understand everything." And when I got that response, I was like, I'm so mortified. The artist thought she was being catfished by some creepy stalker person, which then I came to realize I was. I wanted to get some, right? Because I loved the cake shoe, as well as cake, as well as shoes. And so my overinvestment in that object of study almost mirrored, right, the fetish's overinvestment in their own, right, object substitute. And I had invested that sculpture with a kind of symbolic importance that legitimizes and confirms my identity, right, as an Asian American academic. I would say the cake shoe cannot be eaten, it is varnished. So the artist's query, "Are you Asian?" implies that if I were, I could not occupy a position of scopophilic mastery over the thing or of its creator, which I think, is also itself an interesting assumption that we can certainly talk about. Let me give you another example of that, sense of the idea of investment, right, in the object. And so a colleague of mine sent me this New York Magazine article called 9 Sexy College Classes Happening This Fall. And he was actually in it because he was teaching a course called Queer About Comics, which made it to New York Times Magazine. And to me, it was almost like this example is almost an example of the blur between the racial subject object that is here offered as a kind of joke, the uneasy similarity between the occasion for fetishistic indulgence and academic critique. And so this article highlights, for one, an academic undergraduate course at MIT with the subtitle, Most Fetish Fraught. It's Anthropology 21, Images of Asian Women, Dragon Ladies, and Lotus Blossoms. And so in this article, it reads, quote, through debates about Orientalism, gender, and power, MIT students will work out the circumstances that create and perpetuate the stereotypes of Asian women: dragon ladies, lotus blossoms, despotic tyrants, desexualized servants, and docile subordinates, unquote. And the magazine adds after that, also probably meet a lot of Asian women. And when I saw that, here's my confession, I felt that was funny. I laughed. Because it is a kind of reminder of where the lens of power really is and for whom, right? And the idea of the fetishist showing up and encountering a lot of Asian American feminists is also really funny, except of course when it's in my class. But I thought that the joke really forced a parallel between the occasion for critiquing the fetish for one audience and the occasion for its indulgence for another. And so for the former, the process of self-creation out of disidentification for women, I'm not that image, all that list that you see there, nonetheless mirrors that of those who might show up likewise looking for a repository for their narcissism in an external, image that is not the self. So for the fetishist, I love myself through Asian women. And so to me, that feature inadvertently illuminates the way in which stereotype analysis actually heralds what Wendy Brown has called the wounded attachment of coalitional identity. So as in this MIT course, I was professing one thing, like as an instructor, I'm against stereotyping, while depending on the very object that I was repudiating, which is to say, I recognize that as a teacher in Asian American studies, I do indeed love myself through Asian women. So this is me not letting myself off the hook within the very desiring structure of racist love that I was naming. And I think, given the context of council culture that we find ourselves in now, a very fraught moment for doing critical race analysis, I do think that we're all aware that being interpolated within a specific community also involves performing the so-called right feeling towards it. And so I was very much startled once by a student query to me when we were talking about race fetishism in class. We were actually talking about David Henry Wong's In Butterfly, and she was going to write her paper on it. So she asked me, okay, remind me again why that's wrong. And I was like, oh, and I answered her, about something about what it means to make someone into a sexual object. But I also became keenly aware of how I myself had become a type, right? I was expected to say that race fetishism was wrong. But then if I did, I would also be reinforcing a taboo against and surrounding racial desire. And I think that's part of that complication that casts a kind of metacritical frame around the enterprise of the book that I had just written, right? And that is part of the book, that there is a risk in constructing that prohibition, in naming something as racist love. And in doing so, you actually begin to eroticize that through the taboo. So as Judith Butler reminds us, quote, prohibition is always present in the very position of desire. So finally, when I finished this book, it was at the very moment where anti-Asian violence and bias were coming up on American streets, on the rise. And so then here I was taking ambiguous pleasure in small Asian objects, or you're talking about things like this cartoon that you see in front of you, this Japanese car, or as Erica knows, we've been talking about cute things, this like Harajuku perfume bottle. It seems like such a far cry from what was going on in the world, right? In terms of anti-Asian violence and being targeted on the street for being Asian. And I thought, well, at first glance, the idea of racist love was in direct contrast to the ways in which racial meaning in the United States continues to be harnessed to overtly negative feeling. But then when I thought about aesthetic form like this one, how cute, small, minimalist, things like this intersect with race, I realized that, affect and racial feeling maps onto more than one axis. And so what you're looking at here is a reference to what psychologists call the VAD scale, or how you measure emotion on a valence, and which is positive or negative, but also the degree of arousal, whether something makes you feel excited or makes you feel calm, or degrees of dominance, whether they make you feel in control or out of control. And so thinking about the idea of cuteness, and okay, so this tchotchke makes us feel very positive and affectionate. We're calm, we're in control, we have domination over something that is smaller than us. And you realize, in terms of the opposite end of the idea of the VAD, where a valence is negative, where the arousal is excited, where the measure of dominance is that the viewer is out of control, you realize the extent to which that actually applies the notion of racial profiling, which also derives from a reduction to type. And so then, even though I was talking about one end of that scale, positive views of affection and Asianness and cuteness and love, we realize that race traditionally is considered on the opposite end of the VAD, and how that renders a child in a hoodie carrying a bag of Skittles walking home from school as something that is fearful, that needs a violent reaction. And so, as in current instances of hate crimes against Asian elders and young women, one individual has to be made to stand in for the whole. And that's the basis of racial profiling. What I took as also a foundation to fetishistic reduction. And so it's really the process there, and not the racialized content, that I would emphasize as the fourth takeaway from the book, because we're so bound up, for good reason, with content and the material effects of racialization. Sometimes we don't stop to consider how race is an effective structure and how that structure works, right? So I'm gonna do stop share and say, if the fetish is a story masquerading as an object, then the story tonight that I'm sharing with you is not necessarily only one of content or of any one assigned type. And we can name all the stereotypes that surround Asian racialization, but that the Asian fetish unveils a different story, that there are ruptures in political fantasy that also mark the uneasy oscillation between competing racial imaginaries, right? What it means to be a spectator in front of these images that I'm showing you. And it's definitely one that I myself have experienced. And so I just wanted to end with this cover again, because there's another story about it, insofar as, folks in academia who are students, professors, they do say that they like this cover. But I also showed it to my former roommate from freshman year, and she actually said something that I realized is very taboo, right, to say, and also strikes to the heart of this book, Racist Love's Complication. And she said, "That's sexy." And I would say, yeah, it is. So I'm just going to stop there. I'm going to close and ask Erica to pop back on the screen.
Hi. Thank you so much for the talk. For those of you who are in the audience, a reminder that you can use the Q&A function to ask questions. I'm going to ask Leslie a few questions and we might engage in a little conversation. And then in a few minutes, we'll turn over to all of you. So Leslie, can I ask you a question about how you are adopting Frank Chin and Jeffrey Paul Chan's earlier framework of racist love? So as you talked about a little bit in your talk, this concept has been controversial for condemning Asian American women, for supposedly pandering to Orientalist fantasies and desires. And I'm wondering how you thought about this in writing this book, especially considering that Asian American women continue to face harassment online and elsewhere for being supposedly race traitors. And my impression is that racist love is kind of a slippery concept in this way, and that it easily slides over into that kind of misogynistic thinking in attempts to maintain racial unity. So, how did you navigate this when you were writing the book? And do you think it's possible to secure a feminist theory of racist love, or will there always be the danger of it sliding in the other direction?
Thank you for that question, Erica. I mean, I think sliding is a really good verb to talk about this oscillation of and you saw that in the talk that I just gave. One of the things that I was trying to establish was both the notion of foundation and of the complication, right? So in every chapter, that sliding between the two strikes to the heart of the question that you asked me, because I definitely think that at its foundation, racist love is about how we fix a place within a social hierarchy and how you name desire from a place of power. So yes, to everything that you said about gender and racist love being a mode of domination, for sure. And I think then the slipperiness or the slidiness of what you've suggested really comes from this notion of complication. Who is receiving that message and how are we negotiating it as spectators in a way that does not assume a position of powerlessness in that relation? And to me, the way in which we have revisioned and expanded what we consider to be feminist critique and what we consider to be a feminist object of study or representation of image is very multifaceted in our culture. And it's up to, our interpretation of it. It's a kind of both and, right, answer to the question that I would reply. It's like it does risk that sliding, but there's always this notion of possibility that we can read against the grain of racist love. And I also think that my emphasis at the very end of that talk about, well, do I call out, how do I call myself out in the same structured desire that I'm saying is like, I cannot simply cordon it off. I have to implicate myself, right, with the way that I am also constructed as a type. And also engaged in that very process with my students. So I guess I would say that. So thank you.
Thank you. So my next question is about, so I read the book for the first time from start to finish after having engaged with the material in so many different, more various ways. And so when I did that, I was struck by the shift from the first two chapters, which were focused on children's literature and cuteness, to the second two chapters, which focus on sex robots and sex dolls. And I read the final two chapters as addressing much more overt examples of kink and of violence, and especially in comparison to the outward innocence and childishness of the other materials that you're looking at. And that made me think about conversations in cute studies about whether cuteness is at its most fundamental level about caring for the young and vulnerable, so a kind of positive relation or caring relation, or is aggressive and possessive. And so, do you think that there are important differences between expressions of racist love that take the shape of motherly love or parental love versus sexual love? Or are they fundamentally the same? And if neither is totally innocent, do they still demand different kinds of political critiques?
So I think that's a very sharp question. And I think that I realize that shockingly, right? Perhaps shockingly, I did not make that distinction, right, between the two halves of the book. And I think that, for any of us who are mothers, we actually know how to answer that question, that yes, maternality does engage in issues of domination. And I recognize that the fact that I'm saying that relations of care do encode that aspect of domination. But my first thought of it was I had a colleague here at Wisconsin, Yi-Fu Tuan, who is acknowledged to be the father of humanist geography. And he actually wrote a book called Domination and Affection, which is the way we make pets of things. So it's about our relationship to our pets. And his viewpoint is that your relationship to your pet is one of control. And so that animal training is implicitly sadistic. And he also, talks about things like how gardens and how water fountains encode exactly that sense of control or domination. You're in a fountain, you are requiring water to perform, right, for you. And so I recognize the controversy in saying that. At the same time, like I said, if anyone who's been a mother knows that you are forcing your child to do something, even as motherly love and affection also entails selflessness, right? And boundarylessness. And that's actually also applies to notions of idealized love, right? That is what we take as the pinnacle of it. So yes, there is that. I would also say that about the idea of different political critique or different method. And to me, I think that's a really good question too, because when I was thinking about the idea, well, does it call for some kind of different orientation? And my first thought was, was writing the first chapter, which is on children's literature, I actually agree with all librarians and educators and children's books writers that they're trying to make a progressive intervention, right, in the world by leveraging these animals as stand-ins for, and the chapter is focused on Asian adoptees who appear as pandas, for example. They're trying to make an intervention of that and help children understand not to be biased against difference. In this case, it was species difference. And the fact that I shared that mission made it harder to say, like, I think the controversy is like, oh, I'm not calling out, that group of people. I'm very carefully saying, well, this is something that we have not thought about in the consequences of abstraction. So I thought about that in terms of like, does it call for maybe a difference in political critique or method? And I think it's about the carefulness of how that message is received by an audience.
Mm-hmm. And then there's so much I'd love to say in response to that, but I did want to ask my final question about kawaii culture, because I have my Hello Kitty up there for this event. And so I loved reading that, the final chapter, and thinking about it, the chapter you just talked about it, and thinking about it in relationship to the work on cuteness that you do. So in thinking back on that, I was thinking about my own identity as a half Japanese woman and the work that I've done on kawaii and cuteness. And I always understood my own attachments to kawaii as based in my fragile sense of gendered racial belonging, particularly as multiracial. And with kawaii, like connecting me to my Japanese mother and to other Asian American girls. And I didn't really consider that the kawaii style racist kitsch items, most of which are made in the US that you discuss, all that relevant to my relationship to kawaii culture. And I instead just thought they were like fake kawaii. And so after reading it, the final chapter about fetishism, I see now how even those attachments that I thought of as pure were fetishistic, insofar as I was using objects in an attempt to kind of repair feelings of racial injury or to seek a racial intimacy. And so all that said, beyond this book's broader critique of Asia's fetishization in the United States, What do you hope that Asian American readers and critics in particular will take away for thinking about our own object relations?
Yeah, that question goes at the heart of how I also started this book, because one of the beginning points of this book was that my horror in recognizing that some of the cute things I had were incredibly offensive, right? So looking at the whole history of segregation era tchotchkes, which are racialized household objects that we have now come to repudiate for very good reason in the context of American culture. And yet seeing all these little objects circulating that were anthropomorphic, Asianized, and coming out of Asia, as well. And thinking like, oh, how do I feel about those things? Can I love those things? And I think that, one of the things that you and I know both from working with students is precisely on these kind of intellectual areas that overlap emotional response and intellectual or political critique, and coming in at exactly that intersection. I think that at one level you have to say, oh, you can love your toys, but let's think about our toys. And in even the idea of sexual desire is like, oh, as I may tell my students, you can have a type. You don't need my permission, to say that you have a type. You're attracted to who you're attracted to, or like, yeah, fine. Yes, you can eat pad thai, even though you're reading all about fetishism of Asian cuisine. And I say that because I'm not a policeman of racial desire. And the moment that you do that, and I think that's my ending point for this particular talk, is the moment that you do that, you are complicit in eroticizing transgression, and I think that that's a kind of queer offshoot, right? I know that we're running out of time, so I think I will just end, with that point. But, you don't want to come. I mean, there were reasons for not saying like, there's a more like, is there a moral quality, to this book? And there is, but there also isn't, right?
Thank you. It sounds like we do have time for some questions from the audience. So the first one I thought we could look at is from Cynthia Zhang, and she says, "Thank you, Professor Bo, for the wonderful talk. In Asian American literary artistic circles, I've seen a lot of talk about self-fetishization, accusations that this author is writing for the white gaze or that this artwork is self-orientalizing. Given that these accusations are rarely aimed at Asian-born individuals, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on A, whether these accusations of self-fetishization have validity, and B, what exactly is going on with ideas of race, diaspora, and identity with this fear of making bad art as a BIPOC artist?"
So I think that the final phrase there, you said bad art.
Mhm. Bad art.
I mean, and I think that's interesting because that already collapses the political judgment with the aesthetic judgment, and that the two have to be the same. I mean, I think that my thought about that is, if it's simply Orientalist art, been there, done that, right? That's the aesthetic judgment is not necessarily only about the politicization of that cultural pandering, which is you entered into that with the first question that you had posed, Erica, about Chen and Chan's accusation that Asian American women writers had done exactly that thing. And so that's where I guess I would say, oh, is it that we're against self-fetishization as a political stance, like you're giving in to the gaze, or is it as a form of art? We're just tired of that, right? We have seen that notion of fantasy before so many times that we're actually ready for something new. And for me, I gave the example of Nakadante because I think there's a very complex representation there that comes out of exactly that. You are constructed in this way. And she's like, yeah, fine. And here it is for you, with the twist. And it's always the twist that I think is really intriguing. So I do think that is what, artists of color should play with. We know how we're represented. So rather than going more, of that mode, how do you take that and twist it to your own ends?
Do you think we can do one more question?
Yeah, sure.
So from Ashley Dunn, she says, "Hi, Professor Bowe. Thank you for your amazing presentation. I'm so grateful for you and your body of work. My question is about the notion of authenticity in relation to the concept of equivocation. Because racist love and Asian abstraction seems so contingent on Asian people being equated to material objects, do you think there is a particular anxiety or even rage felt by the white gaze when its target doesn't authentically satisfy their fantasy? For example, what to do with the Asian American girl that doesn't have long, silky hair? Or perhaps in a different sense, what to do with the diasporic Asian who cannot speak their language and has been supposedly tainted by American culture to be crass? Is there an idea of fakeness that is attributed here, which deflates the fantasy brought on by equivocation, just as a painting or vase might be considered to be a fake?"
Could you repeat the last phrase, Erica?
So is this kind of fakeness that is becomes an accusation placed on Asian Americans just equivalent to the way a painting or vase might be considered a fake?
Oh, I see. Painting or vase. Yeah, that is a really good question, and that is actually a very complex question, because the idea of authenticity is itself a fake. So I use the word fantasy there in this title, but the notion of authenticity, the realness of one subject that is real against somebody else's fantasy, is itself a fake. I mean, the idea of cultural authenticity is a moving target. And I think that one of the exposures of that lies in the term cultural appropriation. So I have thought a lot about cultural appropriation and its relationship to the notion of racist love. And what they have in common is that there is a fetishistic reduction that is necessary to the notion of the authentic, right? All of culture is one thing, and it's the originary thing, right? If you're looking at the idea of authenticity, it's the originary thing. It's not the trade-offs. It's not the changes. And so that is itself a fantasy. It's a result of that reduction, all of culture to the one, right? And to me, when you think abstractly about that process, then the explosion of what we consider authentic, the explosion of what we consider of something that needs to be made and fixed so that we can steal it, right? The front of cultural appropriation is not, to me, the appropriation. It's the fixity to the one thing. So I guess I would answer that question that way, because it really explodes into multiplicity, the idea of what we consider like the real object.
Yes. So thank you so much, Professor Bowe, and thank you so much to everybody for asking your questions. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to all of them, but maybe Leslie can take a look later. So I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and thank you so much for listening in.
Thank you all.